Okay, everybody, please come in and sit down. We are going to move on to the next event. Being an instructor gets you.
Yeah, coming back from the coffee break is always...
Sit down, pay attention.
Yes.
Close your laptops. Okay, we are going to get going because that is the only way to stop people from talking and come back from their coffee. So we are very excited to have a fireside chat with Olivier Guersent. Olivier is, of course, Director-General of DG Competition, where he has been for 5 years or so, and very experienced in other parts of the Commission as well. I'm going to ask him some questions that start really based on the issues in the Draghi report, but then continue on to broader issues of big tech. So, first of all, thank you very much for coming to join us. It's a great pleasure to have you here, and somebody with your perspective and experience, especially given the turn that competition policy is taking today. I think it's quite interesting to have that perspective. So I want to ask a couple of questions about resilience and European champions and the like. The first one is, we see a call for relaxing competition policy because managers want to be able to cooperate in areas like sourcing rare earth minerals or sustainability or R&D. And one question is, do we need to weaken competition enforcement to do this, or is there a way for firms to cooperate that's already existing in existing law and procedure and the tools that DG Comp has?
Well, thank you, Fiona. That's an excellent and very topical question. First of all, whether the cooperation takes place abroad or in Europe doesn't make any difference. The ratio legis is not that one. The ratio legis is not where the cooperation takes place, but where the effects are felt. And if the effects are felt in Europe, then of course competition rules, European competition rules would apply. Secondly, we have no a priori or negative a priori on this type of cooperation. I would think rather that in principle they should be pro-competitive. I mean, securing the correct supply of, for example, rare minerals is something that would allow new or existing players to be actually competing in the market. So I don't see immediately why that would be an issue per se, but of course each case needs to be looked at on the merits. Same thing on any type of cooperation on innovation and research and development. We have for a very long time not only guidance but block exemption regulations. And I don't think I remember, but I may have a gap in my memory, but I don't think I remember any case, at least in the last 20 years, in which we had a problem with any of this type of cooperation. So the answer is yes, in principle it's no problem. The general guidance should do, and of course companies and their advisors have to do their own self-examination. And in case there is a doubt, which may happen, because I think we will see a number of type of cooperations that maybe we have not seen before, and therefore there is no general guidance. And we have revised our notice on guidance in 2022 to make clearer that we were ready, which is quite a change versus the first 20 years of Reg 1, to give individual guidance in novel cases. I mean, don't come for us with things that you could figure out yourself, for which there is case law or decision practice or are covered by existing guidance. But if you are in a setting that is not covered and you think either there is no restriction or there is a restriction that is more than outweighed by the benefits, then simply come for individual guidance.
This is great advice. And I would say, summarizing, it sounds like if conduct is output expanding, if it's enabling a new product, enabling firms to compete better, that this is the kind of thing that you would be looking for when firms come to seek that guidance.
Well, in principle, if it's output expanding or if it creates a new innovation, a new service, a new product, it is likely that it would be pro-competitive. In particular, if that new product or service could not go to the market absent the cooperation.
Yep, very good. Okay, second topic is resilience. I think this word is often used in a confusing way. It's often implies that the person speaking it is against American companies or against Chinese companies. I want to think of it just as a normal English word. Resilience in the sense of robust to shocks, okay? And so I think, sorry, got my glasses. I think that if you take it in this way and you then consider how competition enforcement can capture that problem, that we really do have the ability of merger control to think about harms to supply chains, to consumers that come from lessening resilience. And remember, in the normal sense of that word, that would be something like there is a flood, there is a pandemic in some place that affects a supply chain, and is that supply chain robust enough to continue to supply the good to European consumers, or do we get high prices or shortages? And high prices are a traditional harm. A shortage is a price of infinity, that's a harm. And so can we fit this kind of problem into traditional merger control, or do we need some kind of new structure for this? I mean, I'm setting it up for the answer is yes, we can, but let's see what you say.
What would I say? I think you need to be a bit more granular in the answer to that question. Resilience is, for me, for part of the debate, is part of the discussion on efficiencies. And then it depends on a number of things. Do consumers or customers value resilience as something they look at when they look at the competition environment for their supply? In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. If it's yes, it's relatively easy because it's a parameter of competition. For the rest, resilience and efficiencies often go in opposite direction, in the sense that what we call efficiency is something that usually will make the company leaner. We'll take a very simple example, a leaner supply chain, less stocks. That we would consider an efficiency that would decrease the cost. But of course, in reality, it is an arbitrage between taking an ongoing saving on cost versus taking the risk that if an event occurs, your supply chain is disrupted, you have no buffer, and you would be more exposed.
You have no inventory because
yes,
you are just in time.
For example. So there I think this is also something that we can assess in a competition analysis. Now, if by resiliency you mean, I don't know, exposure to change of political regime in a foreign country or stuff like this, that I see a lot more difficult to square in a competition analysis. I don't think we have any standing to make that prognose, actually, or I don't know how we would do that. So if, I think it would not be necessarily illegitimate to take it into account, but then that should be done outside of the competition analysis. So I think we should acknowledge that there are a number of other general interests than competition, and that if there is a balancing act to be made between these various interests, it should be made. This should not be internalized in the competition analysis. We should be able to say, well, this is what the competition analysis tells you. But of course, you may decide differently because you factor in other interests. You have this actually in Article 21 of the merger regulation. So Article 21 of the merger regulation tells you, well, the Commission has exclusive competence for mergers that have a community dimension. Therefore, member states keep off, except when you want to defend an interest that is different from competition. And Article 21 gives 3 examples for which this, at least the legitimacy of the interest would be automatically recognized, and that is defense, plurality of media, and prudential rules, and then opens it to member states being able to invoke different interests than these 3, but then they would have to make their case. So I think this bit of the resilience debate should take place in that frame.
Wonderful, thank you. And let me note for the audience a couple of interesting points that Olivier just made. First, we are dividing resilience into 2 categories. One that is traditional competition concern, like cost and supply chain, and another that is more political. And then secondly, within cost and supply chain, an efficiency that the company thinks is an efficiency because it brings down average cost. Society might not because it creates variance and spikes and is actually bad for consumers. So that's an important distinction.
If I may add something, which I should probably have said from the outset, is that resilience is also diversification. And because, I mean, as part of the kind of old-style industrial policy narrative of resilience is about re-onshoring. Re-onshoring doesn't make you necessarily more resilient. You may need to have some amount of re-onshoring for a key product. For example, I still think it was right to re-onshore part of the production of microprocessors in Europe because you want to have a buffer. And you don't want to be totally reliant on a very distant place that is very close to a very powerful other country. That I fully understand. But we should not, will not, could not re-onshore the whole of our supply chains. And therefore, the bulk of resilience would be achieved through diversification. And guess what? Competition does diversification a lot better than monopolies. So for me, this is probably the biggest contribution of competition policy to resilience, and that is to ensure variety of supplies, choice for customers, and diversification.
Super, thank you. All right, changing topics a little bit, industrial policy. We heard from Commissioner Ribera this morning that there is going to be some change to state aid rules. I would say that the Draghi report reframes industrial policy as not state aid, but EU-wide aid, because it's going to deepen the single market and strengthen the single market. How do you see DG Comp being able to contribute to this EU-wide industrial policy state aid regime and help, as Commissioner Ribera signaled this morning, to make it as pro-competitive as possible?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's also something I need to make some distinctions. EU funds are subjected to different regimes. That is not, strictly speaking, the same control as state aid, but some of the EU funds are subjected to a competition control that is undertaken by DG Comp. Others are not. And the difference is whether they are centrally managed or not. For example, we do have a control on the way the funds of the Recovery and Resilience Facility are used, because these funds are handed over to the member states. The member states uses them. So decentralized management. The same goes for the structural funds and regional policy. When the fund is centrally managed, the decision is taken by the Commission, then we do not have a state aid or a state aid-like control, But of course, what we have is collegiality. And collegiality means that if you take, for example, the CHIPS Act, DG Competition was involved in the shaping of the CHIPS Act. We could make our points, and if we had been dissatisfied, we could have objected, put a negative opinion, and that would have meant that it should be discussed by the College of Commissioners. The Competition Commissioner makes his point, and they take whatever decision it is. So my experience is that when it comes to centrally managed funds, what we have a voice that is heard, also because it would not make logical sense to have zero form of discipline, like, for example, the necessity to put public money that is scarce only where it makes a difference. And therefore, we can influence the design of the fund and the conditionality.
Very good. And the design of the fund and the conditionality, just to make that clear, would be in the direction of stopping government money from allowing the incumbent firms to entrench themselves, and instead designing something that is more open to any competitor and these kinds of principles.
Well, I think the executive vice president has been quite clear in her speech. I think I will almost quote, she said that investment will not flow if investors have the slightest suspicion that they will be confronted with state-supported monopolies or EU-supported monopolies, or will face unfair subsidies. So I take from it that it's not in our intention to promote this type of behaviors, indeed.
Excellent. That is good news. All right. Another topic. There's a lot of discussion in Draghi and also throughout this morning about innovation. What are your concerns about the interaction of innovation and competition policy? My understanding is that this is very important to competition enforcers. It's taken into account in merger control and antitrust, in state aid. Do you think the weight on innovation is sufficient? Is that something to change going forward? What about this idea of a new innovation defense? Is that something that actually is not done at present? Or and I also have a question about its empirical relevance. If you look back over your career, how often do we think that this situation where innovation would be enhanced by the merger has been overlooked, has been a good argument, but somehow overlooked?
Okay, maybe I start by your last point, because that's a good way to get into the issue. I personally have no recollection of a case not in which we rejected an innovation defense, but in which it was presented in a structured and factually grounded way.
Me neither.
So, this said, what we observe is that, okay, innovation has always been a very important parameter of competition. I mean, ever since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution 200 years ago. But what I see is that the innovation waves are shorter and shorter. It comes quicker. I mean, if you think about it, for the first 2 million or so years of the Homos being on the planet, the biggest innovation has been that we were able to knock one rock against the other in a better way. Then in the last 20,000 last years, we invented the fire, we invented the wheel, we invented many things. So innovation took pace really a lot more. And in the last 2,000 years, even more, last 200 years tremendously, and in the last 20 years we innovated more than the whole history of humanity before. And that gives you an idea of, I mean, how innovation becomes more and more important in every aspect of what we do, and therefore more and more relevant to competition policy analysis. When I was a young case handler, a very long time ago, when you were looking at innovation markets, the time lag between the time at which an innovation was happening in the labs and the time at which it was shaping new competition relationships in the market was in years, depending on the industry, 10 years, 15 years, 5 years, whatever, but years. These days, it's in months, sometimes in weeks. So time has shrunk. Innovations come more numerous and more quickly, and therefore they became gradually maybe the most important parameter of competition. You see it also in stock exchange values, where investors do not value so much your turnover of today than the prospect of the innovation of tomorrow and the prospect for growth. And that colors as well a lot competition analysis. So that's the reason why in the last 20 years and even more in the last 10 years under Margrethe Vestager, I think the Commission was probably at the forefront worldwide in devising innovation theories of harm. Of course in tech, but not only in tech, because that is a phenomenon that you observe everywhere. Now what Draghi says is very good. You were right to do that. Maybe you were not so attentive to innovation benefits from either cooperation or mergers. And maybe he's right. And part of the reason is we were not really presented by cases, but it's not completely foolish to think that given how innovation becomes prominent, we will be confronted with cases in the future while not in the past. So to be prepared for that, I think, is quite a good idea. And we lack a bit the theoretical foundations for this. So we need some work. My view is that that will be one of the key points in the reopening and the review, and maybe the revision in the end of the merger guidelines. And I think that's welcome. That will put quite a lot of academics at work and give a lively debate. Of course, as usual, the thing will be in the balancing act and the parameters for the balancing act. How do you balance a relatively high likelihood, relatively severe impact on prices in the short term with a maybe less likely impact on innovation in a slightly longer term? That is where, in my view, the discussion will be taken place. And how do you objectivize the parameters for that decision? What is your compass, in a way? That, I suspect, will be the subject of a lively debate when we will discuss the guidelines.
Maybe putting some of the burden on the firms involved would be a good idea.
Well, we're talking efficiencies. If we're talking efficiencies, the burden is on them in the first place, of course. But the same goes for 101 paragraph 3. As you know, we have already opened for green efficiencies when we revised the horizontal guidelines. And the debate on innovation will also take place in that frame. And I think we will be back with the same questions we have had for positive externalities, which is how broad, how aligned should the efficiency defense in mergers with 101 paragraph 3 test? Because remember, it's for a long time, for the last 20 years, it was fairly aligned, but it has not always been like this. Before 2003, basically in 101 paragraph 1, you had a micro restriction to competition, and in paragraph 3, you have a macro analysis of a wide range of potentially beneficial effects. We changed that in 2003, which means that it's not a question of law, it's a question of policy.
Interesting. Okay. And let me link back this innovation conversation to the earlier panel where Elisabetta Iosso was talking about the ability of the Italians to refer transactions that don't pass the turnover threshold, but are this important asset value test. I think the idea that innovation is more and more important puts a big burden on finding a way to capture those transactions and study them. And also this, of course, links back to the trends that Jan de Locker was talking about this morning that just are pushing us again and more in this direction. I wanted to cover tech titans before we finish, and that is a big topic. In particular, I think what's quite interesting about the DMA is its interaction with Article 102. Of course, many parts of the DMA are designed to obviate the need to bring 102 cases because the rule is set out ex ante. But still, there are conduct that might fall under both, and where we don't know how the courts are going to quite treat the DMA yet. And so it might be possible to have the two tools running at once, or how is comp finding this? Are they complements, substitutes? Is it hard to organize them together? Is it making things easier? What's your assessment?
Maybe before coming to that, I'd like to pick on your previous remarks, which is kind of Article 22 related, because indeed that's there is a link also with the DMA and with tackling innovation. I think the commissioner was right in when she had the question after her opening address that we need to move forward on the enforcement gap, because indeed innovation becomes more and more important, and so we see already that we have more, and we will continue to have more cases in which you can have a quite severe harm to competition, to innovation competition, through a deal that is below any possible thresholds. So the court in its wisdom decided using Article 22 was not the right way to do it. So that leaves us with basically two options: either having more member states with other than turnover thresholds standards, and having a targeted review of Article 22, because I take it, what I take from the court ruling is the court saying as well, it's stunning this, because they say, tribunal, you are absolutely right in your analysis. So you say, oh, great, they will confirm. However, and then it's a disaster. And in the however, what I take from it is, what they say is, well, look, all this is true, but it was 35 years ago. And the world has moved quite a long way in 35 years. In particular, most member states now have a merger control. So you cannot simply rely on that. You need to be re-legitimized by the member states. The legislator needs to tell you again that, yes, this is what they want. So maybe that's also a solution. For the member states, I think it's great that they have different systems to attract cases in their competence outside of the turnover thresholds, because this diversity is an asset that gives us more comfort that we will be able to capture the right cases. And now I'm back to your question. Of course, there can be substitute. There are a number of cases in which you have a DMA infringement that we would have previously pursued under Article 102. And the logic of the DMA is we would not pursue it under Article 102 because the DMA was exactly made to more efficiently pursuing it. That is clear. There are, however, which is what your question suggests, a number of cases where it's not so clear. For several reasons. First of all, the DMA is predicated on the premise that you need to be super specific or specified because it's very intrusive and because we want it to be quasi-automatic. You want that the gatekeepers know exactly what they have to comply with and are able to do it basically without us intervening. That has numerous advantages. That has, of course, one disadvantage. Nothing is perfect in this world. And that is that the more specific you are, the more it is possible to do something else than what is specified and reach exactly the same effect. For this, we have an anti-circumvention mechanism in the DMA, but I guess if you're smart enough, you probably can circle larger way enough to avoid being captured by this as well, in which case, typically, you should use Article 102, and whatever result, say the result of the 102 is that it is an infringement, then I think you should immediately feed that back into the DMA, and we have a specific mechanism for this through delegated act. So if we think it's important enough, we can make it happen within 3 months.
I mean, that's an amazing feature of the DMA, to be able to adjust it like that and so relatively quickly.
So-called future-proofing.
Yeah.
So my take is that in the future you will see cases in which an infringement is kind of covered by the spirit of the DMA, but it's more complicated or uncertain whether it is strictly covered by the provisions. And I guess, not to take any risk, we may open under 2 legal bases. Or cases in which our determination is that it should have been covered by the DMA, but it's not, in the form of the practice, in which case you're likely to have a 102, followed by a delegated act feeding back the result into the DMA. So they're both substitutes in a number of cases and complements in other.
What a terrific answer. All right, our time is up, so please join me in thanking Mr. Guersent for a great interview.